We're so glad you've tuned in to another episode of Beyond Reform. I'm Aniki Clark, your host, and I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Lauren Marsh, head of the Hugh Shearer Labour Studies Institute, and Mrs. Helene Whyte, who is a trade union activist and the General Secretary of the Jamaica Association of Local Government Officers, JALGO. Mrs. Whyte is also the immediate past president of the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Unions, the JCTU. Today we will be discussing the evolving nature of the labour management relationship in Jamaica generally, but we're going to be focusing on the public sector. And both my guests are experts in their field. One as an academic and the other as a veteran trade unionist. Welcome, lady and gentlemen.
Thank you, Ms. Clark.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again for joining us. Laura, if I could start with you. When we speak about labour management relationship, what exactly are we talking about?
Aniki, before we go there, one correction. I'm not just an academic. I also work actively with the unions and colleagues in the public and private sector.
Awesome.
All right. So that's something I do enjoy. Mm-hmm. All right. But regarding the labour management relationship, essentially that particular concept has its roots in the 1930s, right? And the idea behind it is that the employer and the union should be working in a very transparent and collective manner. Essentially, the whole idea of the collective bargaining approach, it has its roots in the labour management integration or approach as well. As it pertains to Jamaica, there are several things that we need to take into consideration. Firstly, we need to look on the role of the social partners, the government, the employer, and the union within this labour management arrangement. The government has a very important role to play. As government, essentially lawmaker, right? It is important for them to regulate the interactions between the employer and, of course, the union in this context, right? And in Jamaica, you'll observe that we have, for example, Labour Relations Code. Mm-hmm. And the code itself is very instrumental in this whole labour management interaction that we're talking about. We also have the Labour Relations and Industrial Disputes Act as well, which helps to regulate the interactions. It speaks about the responsibilities of the employer and the employee. And in the context of the public sector now, as you were making reference to earlier, staff orders for the public service. You'll also observe that essentially that the roles and responsibilities of the employer are also outlined, as well as the responsibility of the employee as well. So when we speak of labour management, we're talking about the intent to have the integration, the interaction being very amicable between the union and the employer. We're talking about the need for transparency, for example, in terms of policies. In an organization or company which is unionized, there's a need essentially for the employer, and in the public sector we're talking to, as we just mentioned, there's a need for the employer to ensure that whatever policies they intend to implement or enforce, there needs to be interaction or communication with the union. Mm-hmm. So in terms of discipline, if they intend to implement a disciplinary policy or discipline an employee who's unionized, there needs to be communication with the union first. Likewise, if the union is disgruntled about a particular issue or policy in the company, the intent is for them not to take industrial action, but to have that kind of communication, that conversation with the employer before they move into taking any kind of industrial action, if they intend to.
Yeah, and I suppose all of this is geared at ensuring that you have a very harmonious labour management relationship.
Exactly.
So how important is that for the sector?
Now, the fact is, if you look at the history, you'll realize that industrial action benefits nobody. It doesn't benefit the country generally or the economy. When I look on the doctrines that exist, if you look at the riots in the 60s or 70s or so on, you realize that when they occur, the economy suffers. So when you have that kind of interactive, amicable discussion between union, even government, and the employer, it works well generally for the country. And within the context of the labour management reach that you're talking about, even the social partnership agreement that we signed some years ago, it speaks volumes to the country's impetus to ensure that there is mutual respect cooperation between the employer and the union, essentially.
But some people feel that if the relationship is too cordial, then the union is not doing its job.
That's true. And maybe in some cases it's true, but I don't have the information on that. But in most cases, though, persons still hold on to this notion, which is a bit archaic, that the union and the employer should have this antagonistic relationship. In the contemporary space, it doesn't benefit either the union or the employer. It doesn't benefit the worker generally. It doesn't benefit the country. And that's why we really encourage interest-based bargaining. If there's an issue, both parties should be able to find a very respectful way of resolving those issues, whether at the local level or at the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, because there are mediums there for intervention, right? But persons in some space, in some industries, they want to see that kind of adversarial approach to discussions or negotiations, which essentially in the long run, as I mentioned, doesn't benefit them. And the truth is, and Nikki, before you go, is that I've seen cases where unions would have said to the membership that your approach was flawed and you're wrong, and they don't want to hear that. They expect at all times that the union should defend them, even when they're incorrect.
Yeah, and I think at this point I really want to bring in Helene. Helene, what's your experience as a practitioner when it comes on to representing employees when they expect, or the view is that the union is too cozy with the government? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think generally speaking, workers tend to be a little bit uncomfortable when there seems to be too much of a good relationship between management and unions. And I think what you find is that if as trade unionists we are able to have the discussions with the workers and even in our training programs address the issue of why it is important for there to be good labor management relationships, then we are able to, deal with the mistrust or the distrust that exists amongst the workforce. And I will tell you, not even just our members, even persons looking on, because we have had a relationship between employers and unions over the years that have come from this adversarial approach where, management and unions, they're enemies and never the twain shall meet.
Yes.
You find persons even outside of the labor force, when they look on, if it appears to them that, you're trying to solve the problems without getting to the need for industrial action, then some persons feel that the union or the unions may not be doing the work that they should be doing. But then I always go back to, what is the role of the union? The role of the union in the workplace in particular is to try to get better salaries and conditions of service for the workers. The how is probably where there may be the difference. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, when we look at what was happening in the past using the adversarial approach, did it get us where we wanted to go? We are now in a particular space, not just in Jamaica, worldwide, where workers and unions are no longer at the helm, so to speak. And so you have to now find a way to be able to survive and still carry out your mandate on behalf of your members. So I know when we have had, since about 2000 in the public sector, we started this approach of having what people generally, we call them memoranda of understandings, where we were looking at all the various things that needed to happen in the public sector. And we negotiated that memorandum of understanding, several of them, without the need for us to have to get to the point of industrial action. But we did come away with what we wanted at the end of the day. The primary thing that we wanted at that time was the protection of jobs. And that was what the members wanted, because there are members who experienced the layoffs of the 1980s, and they know what that meant to them and their families. So they didn't want to go down that road again.
Yes.
And so the protection of jobs was very important for them.
Mhm.
And that's what we negotiated and got. And in return, the government as the employer would determine between us, what it is that they can give us, seeing that we are focusing on jobs and not so much on the wages at that point in time. So I think a lot of it comes down to whether union leaders, and when I say leaders, I'm not just talking heads of unions, I'm talking our delegates and so on, whether they understand the context and the environment within which we are operating. Because at the end of the day, the trade union is no different from any other organization, where you have to look at the context and the environment. So the environment of today is not the same environment of the 60s. So you have to find different approaches. And that is what the trade union movement has been doing in recent times to try to remain relevant. Because if it is that we maintained the old adversarial approach, as they say, the dinosaurs were not able to make the transition, so they are no more. And that certainly would have been the root of the unions. Although, there are many that will say that we are not as strong as we used to be. And that is true.
Okay. You mentioned context and environment, and I want to join Lauren on this. What's the global context in which unions are operating now?
All right. One, for me, based on my research and observation, very mercurial. It's changing very rapidly. We are now seeing where essentially climate change has changed the world of work. We're seeing where the digital economy essentially has also changed the world of work. And as Helene just mentioned, and I do agree with her, that unions will have to evolve. And the truth is, to be fair, Aniki, some are evolving. I don't want to generalize because I work with unions in Jamaica, in the Caribbean as well, the Caribbean space generally, that are evolving. They're in tune with these changes. They are trying to make amends where necessary and improve where they can. But the fact is, with the emerging new jobs that we're seeing, especially in the digital economy and with climate change, the unions, I believe, from my observation and research, are not prepared, or some unions and not all unions. So there needs to be sufficient sensitization in many, many ways. More so, we did a piece of research recently, and I shared with our colleagues at our recent collaboration in Kingston, Montego Bay, where we're seeing where the new entrants in the workspace, they are not very familiar with unions, one. Two, their whole idea of what work entails is a lot different. More so, many of these persons have no interest in following the traditional path which their predecessors or parents utilized to generate income. Okay. So we'll now have to engage these persons and see how best we can get them to appreciate the importance or relevance of unions today. All right?
And we're talking younger
people,
employees.
We had a conversation with students from several high schools about 4 years ago. And what struck me was that not one person in that particular room could tell us what is the importance of a trade union. They didn't know about unions like that. Mind you, I would have changed by now, but they didn't know. And we asked them to give us the name of a very important and prominent trade union person, and they could not give us a name either. So for this, who do we blame? I'm not sure, but the fact is there needs to be a concerted effort by the government, by the unions, by academia, to ensure that persons or younger persons understand the importance of unions.
And you mentioned that there needs to be a concerted effort. How is your institute, the Hugh Shearer Institute, responding to this deficit?
Well, we're doing many things. As a head, my approach is also to collaborate. And we have worked extensively thus far with partners in government, partners in the private sector, partners in academia. And what we're doing is that we're sensitizing persons. We're on the ground. We're having programs delivered face-to-face across Jamaica. And we're also in the virtual space to ensure flexibility and accessibility across the Caribbean space. I've gone a bit further, and I think my good colleague Helene would have spoken about integrating with other labor colleges across the Caribbean region. And the intent is also to do several projects and trainings with Cyprian Labor College. Because my belief is that it's one Caribbean, really. We may have our differences in whatever way it is historically, but the fact is, going forward, we are in the same boat going forward, and we have to work together. So we are doing training extensively, targeting managers and supervisors. We're working with the ILO as well as usual. Those are one of our national partners as well. We're working with the Confederation as well, and with government. So it is just collaboration for me. That is the main mantra going forward.
Right.
For the Institute.
Sure. Thanks for that, Lauren. And Helene, I suppose I also want to hear from you. You've alluded to it earlier that unions must evolve, but what are some of the practical things that they're doing to ensure that certainly this younger generation in the workplace is engaged with the process of I'll call it loosely employee protection, which is what unions are mainly about. How are your union colleagues responding?
Well, I know that in the recent past, one of the things that we felt was necessary to be able to, introduce, so to speak, the concept of trade unionism and to educate persons entering the labor force about trade unionism is that at one point we had an essay competition that would have followed after we would have gone in and had discussions with persons who were on the verge of leaving school at the time as secondary school. We also tried to get a similar thing at the universities, but we were not very successful at the universities. But I think part of the problem that we have now is that I think we have to now rethink how we communicate, because truth be told, a lot of younger persons, they don't gravitate to the spaces that probably you and I would have in order to get information. They're getting their information from different sources.
Yeah.
And something like this, a podcast, would be something that they would more gravitate towards than the traditional media, so to speak. Because the thing about them not knowing anything about trade unions, I have seen situations where they ask them about government systems and so on. They have absolutely no clue either, although it's taught in schools.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that tells us that enough is not being done to meet them where they are. I can say in respect of my own union, we have points where we interact. So we try to get to, say, our firefighters before they join the labor force and give them broad information and so on. And we end up with almost 100% of them at the end of the day joining the union and becoming involved, although their ideas are not the same as the older workers. And I use it in inverted commas. And one good example of that, I know when I was learning to write trade union claims, one of the first things on that was security of tenure, because persons wanted to be assured that they could join a particular workplace and they would have a long life there. Younger workers are not interested in that. They want to be able to move.
Yes.
And so those are some of the things that we have to be grappling with. And in that context, what is the service that we offer for them in that kind of space? And so with contract employment, when it started, we had that concern as well, because seeing that they were seen as contractors, they were not able to be unionized. But what you did find is that several of them needed to have the ability to be able to negotiate with their employer. They couldn't do it on their own. Mm-hmm. And so we had to find means of being able to adjust so that we could have the ability to negotiate for individuals or groups of workers in not the very same way as it would have been done in the traditional trade union realm. And so, and this is why I made the point that we are evolving, because we have to be really serving the potential members out there, because if you're not delivering the service that they want, they will not seek to join. And so we have to be out there trying to get the information to them and to keep them engaged. It is not very easy, and we have to change how we as older trade unionists look at it. But at the end of the day, I think the question of the relevance of the trade union movement is a question that has been on the lips of many for the last 20, 30 years. But the trade unions still exist because we still have a role. I agree that we have to be amending how we operate and in order to be able to continue to remain relevant. But I don't think it is a situation where the trade unions are totally irrelevant.
Okay, and I don't think that will ever be the case, Lauren.
No, and the truth is there's a difference between being relevant and being effective. Unions are relevant. And I'll say to you, as companies, both now public and private, move more towards hybrid contracts, fixed term contracts, and so on, the unions are going to be very instrumental in championing the rights of workers. So they are relevant. The issue is, however, is the level of effectiveness. And as I mentioned before, based on my observation and work with the unions, there are several unions which I'm very proud of in Jamaica. They are evolving. Because in some cases the leadership has changed. Some have realized that if they don't wake up and if they don't get more active, they're going to lose membership. And they are making changes to their operational mandates and so on. But they are relevant. It's the level of efficiency, I believe, which is a concern for us.
And I suppose,
or effectiveness.
Right. And I suppose you, as an institute focused on labor relations and labor studies, you're targeting those gaps which you've identified.
Of course, we have. And what we have done of recent is that last year we were offering free training to union delegates and so on.
How interested are they?
Yeah, man. In regards to that, there are mixed sentiments. There are some persons who will attend. There are others who will not attend for whatever reason. But we do realize that if we empower the unions to do their jobs properly and we sensitize the employers, it will lead to mutual cooperation in terms of how they go about drafting policies, how they interact, and how they go about just doing the general business day-to-day with workers and so on. So I believe personally, I won't say I speak for myself, I believe that we have to work both with the employer and the unions to ensure that there is some stability going forward.
Okay. Helene, do you have continuing professional development amongst unions in Jamaica?
I know that probably about 10 years or so ago, probably maybe longer, the Confederation of Trade Unions sought to establish within Jamaica and also the Caribbean generally a means by which we could be training union delegates and officers starting at the shop floor level and gradually going up the line. So the thinking at the time was at the shop floor level, the Confederation of Trade Unions would deal with that kind of training, and the persons then would call it matriculate into a 1-month program that the institute had, and then we actually partnered to get a certificate program going. I'm not sure if that program still operates. I know prior to the pandemic, it was going on. I'm not sure the extent to which trade unionists are taking it up. I know in the initial stages, several trade unionists did take up the offer for the certificate in, I think, labor studies, right? And that would also enable you now to be able to go into a degree program using the certificate as one of the requirements to go into a degree program. I'm not sure the extent to which there is that, and I hear some of it coming from what Lauren has said, looking at what is happening in the Caribbean generally and trying to ensure that we have that organized kind of training. One of the things that we also recognize is that it is important not to train union officers just by themselves, but it would be good to sort of have management and labor involved in that training program. And from what I understand, when the institute started, that was originally the format. So you would have this situation where managers and trade unionists would be able to operate in the same space, learning basically the similar kinds of information, so that when you get back into the workplace, you would then be building the harmonious relationships that we feel are better for achieving whatever it is that we want for our country. So I think the Institute, being a part of the University of the West Indies, I think is best placed along with the other two labor institutes in the Caribbean to sort of bring together that kind of training so that trade union delegates and officers will be exposed and will be properly trained in, what are the needs of the current labor force and how it is that they can deliver on what it is are those needs.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Helene. I want to shift, Helene, to the new public sector compensation system, which some persons view as a watershed in public sector collective bargaining, where we had a consolidation and restructuring of allowances, a new compensation philosophy, and so on. How is the union movement engaging with the government at this point, Helene, to balance the needs of workers within the fiscal limitations of government, which is always the case?
Well, I think it's important to note that the new compensation structure really arose out of discussions between the government and the leaders of the Confederation of Trade Unions, because over the years we had been expressing concerns about the fact that it was becoming very difficult to attract and retain talent in the public sector because of the vast gap between wages paid in the public sector and wages paid in the private sector for comparable skills. And so we agreed, having signed off on a 3-year agreement in 2017, I believe, that one feature would be that the government would start an exercise that would be aimed at looking at how salaries are paid in the public sector. So what we wanted to do first and foremost is to look at what we call internal equity. How are the different elements of the public sector paid, even within the public sector? Because at the time we were having situations where persons who are in the central administration were being paid far lower salaries than those who are in government organizations, quasi-government statutory bodies, who are being paid much higher for doing similar work. And so we felt that there needed to be some internal equity. And also in terms of external equity, now we needed to look at what was the relationship between wages paid in the public sector as against wages paid in the private sector. One of the things that was a feature of that exercise within the public sector is that because you started with a job evaluation system where all jobs were evaluated using the same tool, you would be able to look right across the public sector and you could relate jobs to each other because of the points that they would have gotten in a job evaluation exercise. So it would not be a situation because I'm at X place and you are in the Ministry of Construction that we are going to be seeing that you are paid much higher in the statutory body for the same skill, because we would have gone through and done that empirical work to determine that, where these positions fall. And then a similar thing was done where a salary survey was conducted of salaries paid in the private sector, and you had comparable salaries in the public sector. And on that basis, when the information came in, big part of the problem was to determine now in the context of the ability to pay,
right,
whether it is that the government could implement a one-on-one relationship. As it turns out, and I think most of us would know, that was impossible. So we ended up with just about 50% of the market being what it is that was agreed. But I think the important thing is that there are some persons who believe that doing an exercise like that would mean that there would be no need for negotiations going down the road. The truth is, this is not the first such exercise that was being done. Probably it's the most comprehensive. But we have had situations before where these exercises have been done. The problem is that they would have started implementing and not able to complete the implementation Thankfully, we are at the point where the implementation has been completed now, and we are moving into another wage cycle. And so it does not mean that unions don't have a role to play, because at the end of the day, you would have implemented some things based on information that was available then. Now you have to look at whether the dynamics have changed. Is the government able to pay better than 50% of the market? Or when you look at what is happening in the general labor market, because there are changes that are taking place in the labor market daily. So some skills would have been highly valued in one dispensation. And when you do a salary survey now, you realize that that skill is not as highly valued as it was then. So we now have to be constantly looking at the work that has been done to make sure that that work remains relevant. So even something, there is a part of the agreement that speaks to us looking at inflation over the period of implementation and to determine how inflation has dealt with what was actually implemented. And so there's going to be that discussion and negotiation as to whether adjustments are now necessary based on what has happened in terms of inflation, based on what has happened in terms of labor market dynamics, etc. So the unions still exist for that purpose. And so I am not one of those persons who is concerned that the implementation of this exercise means that the unions will no longer have any relevance in terms of collective bargaining in the public sector.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, Helene. And as we wrap, Lauren, what are the trends? What are those trends you think unions should be paying close attention to in the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay. As I mentioned a while ago, they need to pay attention essentially to the digital space, what's happening in terms of job creation. They also need to pay very keen attention to the emergence of AI technology and what's happening. Thirdly, climate change. They need to also pay attention to that as well because there are jobs emerging. We have also realized that the transport sector will be impacted in a very serious way as it pertains to the move from petroleum to more solar or battery-powered or electrical vehicles, right? My recommendation is to encourage unions to work closer with their regional and international partners. You would have seen in the tabloids recently where Senator Gale was appointed to the executive of the International Transport Workers Federation. And I believe that this is a very important move for the country itself because one, for networking, two, for information. When you work closely with your international partners, you will have information that can help you to forecast the challenges that may eventually emerge in the local space. Also, training and sensitization. I mentioned it, Helene mentioned it. Unions need to focus more on training their membership, training their delegates and officers and so on, so they understand what their roles are essentially. And the traditional approach to collective bargaining, extremely important, but I believe that now is the time if we intend to experience economic growth. It's not only the government's responsibility. Unions and employers have to work in a very amicable manner. They have to work together. They have to sit together. Mind you, as we mentioned, that when this happens, some workers may have an issue with it, but the way forward is simply unity between the union and the employer. That's all I have to say.
Okay. And Helene, from your perspective, what are those issues that you think your colleagues should start championing going forward?
I think Lauren has spoken to several of them, and I have to agree with what he has said. In fact, I am speaking to you from a conference of public services international in what we call the Inter-Americas, and all of these issues are issues that are being dealt with now. Issue of climate change. We have something that we call tax justice. how are our people, well, not our people, but big businesses and so on, whether they are paying their fair share. All of those are issues that confront trade unions right across the world. And, when we look at, say, climate change, and for workers in the public sector, the kind of impact it has on them and their ability to carry out their functions, it's extremely important that these are issues that the union movement actually, adopt, keep abreast of. And, we don't just stay in the narrow collective bargaining, what some people call bread and butter trade unionism, that we have to look wider than that, because at the end of the day, these other issues will affect the bread and butter issues. So we have to look at what's happening in labor markets across the world. What are the skills that are in demand? Are persons organized or trained? I know from my own standpoint, I've been saying to my members, even in respect of their children, be clear as to the kinds of professions your children are entering into, because a lot of us think of the traditional professions, and what we have found is that that is not where the world is going. But you won't know that unless you actually have the benefit of the information, the issue of training and retraining. And again, as far as trade unions are concerned, we adopt a view of trade unionism that is not just about the narrow bread and butter issues, but we are talking about the worker, not just at work, but the worker in his environment. And so because of that, there are all these other things that we as leaders have to become acquainted with, have to become knowledgeable about, and have to be able to bring workers themselves along with us so that at the end of the day, they can take advantages of opportunities as they arise.
Yes, very sobering note, Helene. I suppose it's keeping your finger on the pulse, but keeping your eyes on the future. Thank you so much, lady and gentlemen, for talking with us about the evolving role of unions in the workplace, specifically in the public sector. It certainly was an enlightening discussion, and I hope you, our listeners, found it interesting as well. I'm your host, Aniki Clark, inviting you to follow this podcast by searching Public Sector Transformation Jamaica, wherever you get your podcasts, so you never miss another episode. Thank you very much, Lauren and Helene.
Thank you, Aniki.
Thank you.
Catch you next time. Bye for now.